Broke Divorcee started over at 59. She built an empire that stunned everyone. Shirley stared at the eviction notice trembling in her hands, her daughter's voice echoing from the phone call that had just ended. "Mom, you're delusional if you think you can start a business at your age." The bank account showed $37. Her ex-husband was celebrating his new life with Nicole, while she faced losing everything. But something in Shirley's eyes hardened as she crumpled the notice. What she did next would shock them all. At 59, Shirley Brennan had become a ghost haunting her own life. The woman who once commanded respect in high school classrooms, who had guided struggling teenagers to academic success, who had been the backbone of every family decision for 32 years, now felt as substantial as morning mist, visible but easily scattered by the slightest breeze. Her modest two-bedroom apartment in Millbrook felt like a museum dedicated to someone else's achievements. Wedding photos lay face down in cardboard boxes, their silver frames catching dust in the closet where dreams go to die. The kitchen table, scratched from years of homework sessions and family meals, now served as mission control for her daily battle against financial ruin. Overdue bills arranged in careful piles according to urgency, a calculator that had become her most trusted companion, and a notebook where she tracked every penny with the precision of a wartime quartermaster. The morning light filtering through curtains she'd sewn herself revealed truths she'd been avoiding with the skill of someone who'd perfected denial as an art form. Her marriage wasn't just over. It had been dead for years, kept alive only by habit and fear of the alternative. Her savings weren't just depleted. They'd been systematically transferred to accounts she couldn't access, leaving her with legal debt that felt as crushing as the weight of 32 years of deferred dreams. Standing before the bathroom mirror that had reflected her face through decades of small compromises and silent sacrifices, Shirley saw a stranger wearing her features. Gray roots threaded through month-old highlights she could no longer afford to maintain. A reminder that even vanity had become a luxury beyond her reach. Her teacher's posture remained straight. Some habits die harder than marriages, but her shoulders carried the accumulated weight of every time she'd made someone else's needs her priority while her own withered from neglect. The reflection staring back at her held questions she'd been afraid to ask. When had she stopped being Shirley and become simply Robert's wife, Amanda's mother, the woman who packed lunches and attended PTA meetings while her own identity gathered dust, like those wedding photos? When had her dreams become so quiet she'd forgotten they were still breathing? Her teaching career felt like something that had happened to another person in another lifetime. She could barely remember the satisfaction of watching a struggling student's face light up with understanding, the pride of seeing her classroom management techniques adopted by younger teachers, the respect she'd commanded during faculty meetings when her opinion actually mattered to someone besides herself. That woman, confident, capable, valued, seemed as foreign now as the life she'd once lived in the house Robert now shared with Nicole. The house where Shirley had planted the garden that bloomed every spring without her, where she'd painted the kitchen walls that had witnessed thousands of family conversations, where she'd built a life that had been dismantled as efficiently as a business liquidation. Her daughter Amanda, 28 and successful in her own right, carried her father's pragmatic nature like armor against her mother's unrealistic expectations. Their phone conversations had become exercises in polite management, with Amanda offering the kind of practical advice you'd give to an elderly relative who'd lost touch with reality. "Mom, you need to be sensible about your situation. Mom, you can't live on hope. Mom, maybe it's time to consider your options." The options Amanda suggested always involved accepting less, a smaller apartment, a part-time job that required no skills, a life of careful budgeting and quiet resignation. They were the suggestions of someone who loved her, but couldn't see past her current circumstances to remember who she'd once been or imagine who she might still become. Betty Watkins, her 62-year-old neighbor, remained the only person who still looked at Shirley and saw potential, instead of problems. A retired nurse with the kind of fierce loyalty that had made her legendary in hospital corridors. Betty possessed the rare gift of seeing people's capabilities rather than their circumstances. But even Betty's unwavering support couldn't quiet the voices, both external and internal, that whispered that 59 was too late for new beginnings, too old for relevance, too set in patterns to change. The social circle that had once included Shirley now orbited around Robert and Nicole's younger, more glamorous lifestyle. Former friends like Carol Lewis, 55 and still married to her college sweetheart, had chosen sides with the subtle cruelty of people who preferred their charity cases at a comfortable distance. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls became brief and awkward, filled with the kind of careful politeness reserved for people whose problems might be contagious. Even the practical aspects of starting over seemed designed to humble her into submission. Her teaching credentials had expired during the years she'd spent supporting Robert's career moves, following his promotions from city to city like a corporate wife, playing an increasingly thankless role. Her resume showed a decades-long gap that screamed unemployable to potential employers who valued fresh faces over deep experience. At job interviews, the few she could secure, Shirley watched 20-somethings get positions she was overqualified for, their enthusiasm masking their inexperience, while her wisdom was dismissed as outdated. "We're looking for someone who can grow with the position," became code for, "We want someone who won't remind us that experience has value." If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, you're not alone. This story is for you. Stay with me. The isolation cut deepest during the hours when normal people were living normal lives. Grocery shopping became an exercise in careful mathematics, watching other women fill their carts without consulting calculators, seeing families purchase items Shirley now considered luxuries. She'd become an expert at making a single bag of groceries stretch across a week, at finding protein in combinations that would have horrified the woman who once planned elaborate dinner parties. Her daily routine had crystallized around the rhythm of financial triage. Morning coffee, 1 cup stretched with extra water, while sorting bills into categories, urgent, critical, and catastrophic. Afternoons spent calling creditors, her voice carefully modulated to convey responsibility without desperation, negotiating payment plans with the skill of someone who'd learned diplomacy the hard way. Evenings dedicated to job searches that felt increasingly futile, scrolling through positions that required skills she didn't have or offered salaries that wouldn't cover her basic expenses. But late at night, when the apartment settled into quiet and the immediate crises were temporarily managed, something else stirred in the silence. Memories of the woman she'd once been surfaced like photographs developing in a darkroom. She remembered the satisfaction of helping struggling students finally grasp difficult concepts, the way parents had sought her advice about their children's futures, the respect she'd commanded when her opinion was valued and her expertise recognized. She recalled the teenager who'd been labeled learning disabled until Shirley recognized his kinesthetic learning style and watched him transform from class clown to honor roll student. She thought about the girl who'd been told she wasn't college material until Shirley helped her craft essays that earned scholarships to schools she'd never dared to consider. She remembered the parents who'd thanked her for seeing potential their children couldn't see in themselves. Those memories lived in her like seeds, waiting for the right conditions to grow, dormant but not dead, forgotten but not gone. They whispered that the skills she'd used to transform young lives might still have power, that the patience she'd developed working with frustrated teenagers could be applied to adults facing their own learning challenges, that the wisdom she'd gained through decades of teaching and parenting might be exactly what someone else needed to hear. The storm clouds gathering on the horizon of her carefully managed existence carried the scent of change. She could feel pressure building toward a moment that would either break her completely or forge her into something stronger than she'd ever been. The question wasn't whether the storm would come. It was whether she'd have the courage to stand in the wind and discover what remained when everything else was stripped away. In the growing darkness of another evening alone, Shirley began to understand that rock bottom wasn't a place of defeat. It was a foundation solid enough to build something entirely new. Chapter 2. The call that shattered her carefully maintained composure came on a Tuesday morning while Shirley nursed her second cup of coffee, trying to make the grocery money stretch until Friday. Amanda's voice carried that familiar edge of barely contained frustration that made Shirley's stomach clench with the anticipation of disappointment. "Mom, I just got off the phone with Dad. He says you're behind on rent again." The words landed like physical blows because they carried the weight of absolute truth. The eviction notice had been haunting her kitchen table for 3 days, 30 days to pay or vacate, printed in unforgiving black ink. Each morning she'd stared at those numbers, willing them to transform into something manageable, hoping for a miracle that seemed as likely as spontaneous combustion. "I'm handling it, honey. You don't need to worry about..." "How are you handling it, Mom? With what money?" Amanda's voice rose with each syllable, carrying the exasperation of someone who'd reached the end of their patience with a problem they couldn't solve. "You can't keep living in denial. Maybe it's time to consider moving to one of those senior communities, something more appropriate for your situation." The word appropriate hit like a slap across everything Shirley had once been. Appropriate, code for giving up, for accepting that her life was effectively over at 59, for becoming the stereotypical divorced older woman who'd failed to secure her future and now needed to be managed by her adult children like a household expense that had gotten out of control. "I'm not ready for a nursing home, Amanda." "It's not a nursing home, it's assisted living. And maybe you could get a job there, in the kitchen or something. At least you'd have housing and meals provided." Shirley closed her eyes, feeling the familiar sensation of being treated as a problem to be solved, rather than a person with unrealized potential. Even her own daughter, the child she'd sacrificed her teaching career to support through school activities and emotional crises, now saw her as a burden requiring practical solutions rather than someone capable of creating her own opportunities. "I've been thinking about starting something small, maybe tutoring or helping people with..." "Mom, stop!" The exhaustion in Amanda's voice was palpable, heavy with the weight of repeated conversations that went nowhere. "You haven't worked in 15 years. You don't have a business degree or startup capital or any understanding of how the modern world operates. You're almost 60 years old. This isn't the time for fantasies. It's time to face reality." The word fantasies settled into Shirley's chest like a stone, crushing every whispered dream, every possibility she dared to consider during those late-night moments when hope felt stronger than fear. Every skill she'd ever developed, every success she'd ever achieved, every moment when someone had valued her expertise, all of it reduced to delusion by the daughter she'd raised to be strong and independent. "I have skills, Amanda. I was a good teacher. I understand how people learn. I can help them solve problems." Teaching high school English 20 years ago doesn't qualify you to run a business in today's economy. Please, just be practical for once. Dad's willing to help you find something reasonable if you stop being so stubborn about accepting reality. After Amanda hung up, Shirley sat in the silence of her empty apartment. The eviction notice spread before her like an indictment of every choice she'd made since her divorce. The walls seemed to press closer, filled with the echo of her daughter's words and the weight of her own growing doubt. She walked to her bedroom with the careful steps of someone afraid that sudden movements might shatter what little remained of her composure. In the bottom drawer of her dresser, beneath sweaters she could no longer afford to dry clean, lay a manila folder she hadn't touched in months, a collection of evidence from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Inside were her old teaching evaluations, letters from parents thanking her for helping their children discover their potential, newspaper clippings from academic competitions her students had won under her guidance. The faded ink on certificates of appreciation told the story of a woman who had once mattered, whose skills had made measurable differences in young lives, whose expertise had been sought and valued by people who trusted her with their most precious concerns. As she read through testimonials that praised her patience, her insight, her ability to connect with struggling students, Amanda's words echoed with crushing force. 20 years ago doesn't qualify you for anything today. The doubt crept in the cold air through poorly sealed windows, chilling every warm memory, every moment of professional pride. Maybe Amanda was right. Maybe she was living in a fantasy, clinging to achievements that had expired along with her teaching credentials. Maybe at 59, with gray hair and outdated experience, she really was too old to matter to anyone besides social service agencies and adult children who needed to manage her decline. But then she remembered Jenny Martinez, a sophomore who'd been failing English until Shirley took extra time to understand her learning style. Discovering that Jenny processed information through visual patterns rather than traditional text. Jenny had gone on to college, then law school, and still sent Christmas cards thanking Shirley for believing in her potential, when everyone else had written her off as academically hopeless. She thought about Marcus Thompson, whose parents had wanted to hold him back a grade until Shirley developed an individualized reading program that helped him discover his love for science fiction. The same boy who'd been labeled a slow learner had become an engineer, crediting his success to the confidence Shirley had helped him build, when confidence was the only thing standing between him and educational failure. These weren't ancient history. They were proof that she possessed something valuable, something that had transformed lives and could potentially transform them again. The patience that had guided frustrated teenagers through academic challenges, the intuition that had helped her recognize different learning styles, the ability to see potential that others missed. These skills didn't have expiration dates stamped on them like cartons of milk. As Shirley sat surrounded by evidence of her former effectiveness, feeling the weight of her daughter's dismissal and the approaching threat of homelessness, something began to shift inside her chest. The anger that had been simmering beneath her carefully maintained politeness started to burn with a cleaner flame. She was tired of being invisible, exhausted by being managed, finished with accepting other people's definitions of what was possible for her life. The eviction notice suddenly looked different under the growing fire of her determination. Not like a death sentence, but like a challenge that dared her to prove everyone wrong, including the voice in her own head that had begun to sound suspiciously like Amanda's practical pessimism. She had 30 days to demonstrate that the woman who'd once transformed struggling students could transform her own circumstances. 30 days to prove that experience had value, that wisdom could be monetized, that 59 wasn't too late for relevance. The first act of rebellion was small but symbolically significant. Shirley walked to the Millbrook Public Library with her shoulders squared and her chin raised, carrying a notebook and her expired teaching credentials, like weapons of possibility rather than artifacts of obsolescence. The librarian, a kind-faced Asian woman whose nameplate read Mrs. Chen, directed her to the computer terminals where Shirley began the slow, sometimes frustrating process of researching tutoring requirements in their state. Her fingers moved hesitantly across the keyboard. Technology had always been Robert's domain, another area where she deferred to someone else's expertise rather than developing her own. But necessity proved to be a patient and thorough teacher. Slowly, methodically, she began to navigate websites about educational, consulting, small business licensing, adult learning methodologies, and the bureaucratic requirements that stood between intention and implementation. The first revelation was encouraging. Her teaching certification could be renewed through continuing education courses available online, a process that would take time but not require returning to a traditional classroom setting. The second revelation was daunting. The costs for renewal, business licensing, and basic startup expenses would require money she simply didn't possess. But Shirley had spent decades stretching household budgets, finding creative solutions to family problems, making something substantial from ingredients that seemed inadequate to the task. She began to approach her business idea with the same resourcefulness she'd once used to feed 4 people on a grocery budget meant for 2. She crafted handwritten flyers with the careful penmanship that had once filled chalkboards with lesson plans. Experienced educator available for tutoring, all subjects, all ages. Patient, affordable, results-oriented. Her phone number was written in neat digits at the bottom, with tear-off tabs for interested families to take. A quaint marketing approach that felt more authentic than anything she could have created on a computer. These simple announcements went up on community bulletin boards in libraries, grocery stores, coffee shops, anywhere parents might pause long enough to consider their children's academic struggles. Each posting felt like a small act of faith, a quiet declaration that she had something valuable to offer if people were willing to look past her age and circumstances to see her capabilities. The first call came 3 days later, while Shirley was organizing her teaching materials and wondering if anyone would respond to her modest advertisements. Maria Santos's voice was hesitant, her English accented but clear, carrying the careful politeness of someone who'd learned to navigate systems that weren't designed for people like her. "I see your paper at the library," Maria began. "My son Diego, he failing 7th grade math and science. We try other tutors, but is too expensive. $60 every hour. I can only pay $20. I know is not much money, but—" "$20 is perfectly fine," Shirley interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "When would you like to start?" That first session took place at Shirley's kitchen table, the same scarred surface where she'd spread out her failures and fears just days earlier. Now it became a classroom where Diego Santos, a bright 13-year-old with frustrated eyes and careful posture, sat across from a woman who still remembered how to see potential hiding behind academic struggles. Within 15 minutes, Shirley recognized the problem that had been plaguing Diego through years of traditional instruction. He was a kinesthetic learner, trapped in a system designed for visual and auditory processors. Abstract mathematical concepts became concrete when she demonstrated fractions using measuring cups from her kitchen, when she showed him how scientific principles applied to cooking and building, when she let him manipulate objects while working through problems that had once seemed impossibly complex. Diego's face transformed as understanding dawned, the same expression Shirley had witnessed hundreds of times in her teaching career. The moment when confusion crystallized into clarity and a child realized they weren't stupid, just different. By the end of the 2-hour session, Diego had completed homework assignments that had frustrated him for weeks, working through problems with a confidence that had been absent when he'd arrived. "Mrs. Brennan," he said as his mother came to collect him, his voice carrying wonder and something that looked like hope. "Can you help me with my English paper, too? I have good ideas, but I don't know how to make them sound right on paper." Maria Santos's eyes filled with tears as she pressed a $20 bill into Shirley's hand, the money warm from being clutched in nervous fingers. "He hasn't wanted to do homework in months," she whispered. "What did you do that his teachers cannot do?" "I listened to him," Shirley replied simply, the truth settling around them like a benediction. Sometimes that's all it takes, really listening to understand how someone thinks instead of trying to force them to think the way we do. Chapter 3. Word spread through the Hispanic community with the quiet efficiency of mothers sharing hope. Maria Santos told her sister, who mentioned it to her neighbor, who passed the information to her co-worker during their lunch break. Within 2 weeks, Shirley had 5 regular students, each carrying their own story of academic struggle and family determination to find solutions that traditional systems couldn't provide. There was Elena Rodriguez, a high school senior whose dreams of college seemed impossible until Shirley helped her understand that her struggles with standardized tests stemmed from test anxiety rather than lack of knowledge. Carlos Mendez, a middle schooler who'd been labeled disruptive, until Shirley recognized his need for movement while learning and incorporated kinesthetic techniques that transformed his behavior. Sarah Kim, whose Korean immigrant parents pushed for perfection, but couldn't understand why their brilliant daughter couldn't express her ideas in writing. Each $20 session brought Shirley $100 a week. Not wealth by any measure, but enough to buy groceries without calculating every penny, enough to make rent payments without panic attacks, enough to begin believing that her skills had measurable market value in a world that had seemed determined to declare her obsolete. But success, even modest success, attracted attention from predictable sources. Amanda called after hearing about the tutoring through a mutual acquaintance, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone whose carefully constructed solutions were being ignored by the problem they were meant to solve. "Mom, you can't run a business out of your apartment. What about insurance? What if a child gets hurt during a session? What if parents decide to sue you? You're not thinking this through with any kind of rational planning." The litany of potential disasters felt like listening to someone describe all the ways walking downstairs could result in death. Technically possible, but focusing on catastrophic outcomes rather than successful daily navigation by millions of people who managed to reach the bottom floor intact. "I'm being careful, Amanda. These are good families who need help I can provide." "That's not how liability works, Mom. Good intentions don't protect you from lawsuits when something goes wrong, and charging money for help, it just seems—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Shirley heard the unspoken judgment. Nice women helped others out of kindness, not for profit. Making money from her skills somehow diminished their value, made her seem desperate or grasping, transformed genuine assistance into mercenary calculation. The resistance came from other quarters as well. Carol Lewis cornered her at the grocery store, positioning herself between Shirley and the checkout line with the territorial aggression of someone defending community standards from contamination. "Oh, Shirley, I heard you're taking in children now. Are you sure that's safe? I mean, you don't really know these families, do you? And their backgrounds could be questionable." Carol's voice carried the kind of concern that felt more like accusation, wrapped in the language of protection, but delivered with the unmistakable scent of prejudice. The implication was clear without being stated directly. The families who sought Shirley's help were different, foreign, potentially dangerous, the kind of people respectable women should avoid rather than welcome into their homes. That Shirley was charging money for her services made it worse somehow, as if poverty had stripped away her right to financial boundaries or professional dignity. But the cruelest resistance came during a phone call about Amanda's engagement party, logistics, when Robert's voice carried that familiar note of dismissive amusement that had once made Shirley question her own perceptions of reality. "I heard you're playing teacher again," he said. The word playing reducing 30 years of professional experience to childhood make-believe. "Just don't get carried away, Shirley. Remember what happened the last time you had big ideas about your career." The reference cut deep because it targeted her most vulnerable memory, 15 years earlier when she'd been offered a department head position at a prestigious private school. She'd been excited, energized by the possibility of professional advancement, had started making plans for their family to relocate, had even begun researching houses in the new city where her expertise would be valued and her contributions recognized. Robert had let her dream for 3 weeks before casually mentioning he'd accepted a promotion that would require them to move in the opposite direction. No discussion, no consideration of her opportunity, no acknowledgement that her career might matter as much as his advancement. "Your little hobbies are fine," he'd said then, with the indulgent tone reserved for children who needed to be gently corrected. "But let's keep our priorities straight about what really matters to this family." Now, hearing that same dismissive chuckle, Shirley felt something crystallize in her chest. Not the collapse of confidence she'd once experienced, but its reconstruction into something harder and more durable. The tutoring wasn't a hobby or a game or a way to fill empty hours until she accepted her irrelevance. It was the first time in decades she'd felt genuinely useful, authentically herself, valued for skills that belonged to her rather than services she provided to others. She began documenting everything with the meticulous attention to detail that had once made her lesson plans the envy of other teachers. Student progress reports, parent feedback, financial records, evidence of improvement that could be measured and verified rather than dismissed as wishful thinking or midlife delusion. Diego's grades had jumped from failing to honor roll in 6 weeks. Elena had scored high enough on her retaken SATs to qualify for merit scholarships at state universities. Carlos's behavior reports showed a complete transformation from disruptive to engaged, with teachers noting his improved focus and participation in class discussions. These weren't subjective opinions or generous interpretations. They were quantifiable results that proved her methods worked. Her instincts were sound. Her experience had tangible value in the real world of struggling students and worried parents. The turning point came during her 4th week of tutoring, when Diego's mother brought her sister Anna to meet the woman who'd transformed her nephew's academic prospects. Ana Morales was small in stature, but large in presence, a woman with calloused hands and tired eyes, who carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd built something meaningful from nothing. "I clean houses for 15 years, Anna explained in careful English that grew more confident as she spoke. "Good work, steady customers who trust me with their homes, but I want to grow bigger, hire more women, make it real business with proper systems and professional reputation." She paused, her hands folding and unfolding in her lap as she gathered courage to continue. "I understand business papers, tax requirements, how to advertise proper way that brings respect instead of just cheap prices. People see cleaning lady and think we know smart enough for real business thinking." Shirley looked at this hard-working woman who'd built a successful service from determination and skill, who faced the same dismissive assumptions about her capabilities that Shirley had encountered from family and former friends. Recognition flowed between them, the understanding that came when two people realized they were fighting similar battles against similar prejudices. "I might be able to help you with that," Shirley heard herself saying, the words emerging with surprising certainty. "I understand business planning, marketing strategies, financial organization. Maybe we could help each other." Anna's face brightened with the same sudden illumination Shirley had seen in Diego's eyes when he finally grasped a difficult mathematical concept. "You would do this? You think I can be real businesswoman?" "I think you already are a real businesswoman," Shirley replied, feeling something shift inside her chest, a door opening onto possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. "You just need help organizing what you've already built so other people can see its value too." The partnership began simply. Shirley would help Anna with business planning, marketing materials, and financial organization in exchange for weekly cleaning services she couldn't afford to pay for in cash. But as they worked together at Shirley's kitchen table, both women realized they'd stumbled upon something more valuable than a practical arrangement. Anna's English was better than she believed, her business instincts sharp and practical in ways that came from years of direct experience with customer service and quality control. She'd been running her cleaning service like the successful entrepreneur she was, just without the formal structure or professional confidence to expand beyond her current limitations. Shirley helped her organize financial records that had been kept in shoe boxes and spiral notebooks, translating Anna's intuitive understanding of profit and loss into systems that could support growth and professional presentation. Together, they developed marketing materials that emphasized quality and reliability rather than competing solely on price, creating a brand identity that reflected Anna's pride in her work rather than apologizing for her circumstances. In return, Anna taught Shirley things that business schools didn't cover: how to read people quickly and accurately, how to price services that reflected both value and accessibility, how to build trust in communities that had good reasons to be suspicious of outsiders offering help that seemed too good to be true. "You know charge enough," Anna told Shirley after observing a tutoring session where Diego worked through algebra problems with the confidence of someone who'd discovered his own intelligence. "That boy's grades, they go from failing to honor roll in 1 month. His mama, she pays $60 for other tutor who do nothing but make him feel stupid. You worth much more than $20. Following Anna's practical advice, Shirley raised her rates to $35 per hour, expecting to lose students who couldn't afford the increase. Instead, parents respected the pricing as reflecting quality service, understanding that professionals who valued their own expertise were more likely to provide results worth paying for. Her weekly income jumped to $250, enough to pay rent without panic, buy groceries without counting every item, and start building a small emergency fund that felt like the foundation of genuine financial stability. But success created new challenges that stretched her comfort zone in unexpected directions. Her apartment was becoming too small for the growing number of students seeking help. She needed proper educational materials rather than hand-drawn worksheets and borrowed textbooks. Parents were asking about group sessions, specialized programs, expanded services that went beyond individual tutoring to address broader learning challenges. Betty Watkins watched these developments with growing excitement, her retired nurse's instincts recognizing the signs of someone coming back to full health after a long illness. "You're glowing, Shirley," she observed during one of their regular coffee sessions. "I haven't seen you this alive since before Robert started treating you like furniture that needed to be politely endured rather than genuinely appreciated." The comment struck Shirley as profoundly accurate. She was glowing, not with makeup or expensive treatments she couldn't afford, but with the inner radiance that came from using skills she'd almost forgotten she possessed, from being valued for contributions that mattered, from building something meaningful with her own hands and mind and heart. Have you ever had to prove your worth to people who'd already decided you didn't have any? Share your story in the comments below. But growth also attracted attention Shirley hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure she wanted. A formal tutoring center across town began asking pointed questions about her credentials and business licensing, their inquiries delivered with the kind of professional concern that felt more like territorial protection than genuine worry about educational standards. Carol Lewis mentioned to several mutual acquaintances that Shirley was working without proper certification, her tone suggesting deep concern for community welfare, while her eyes held something that looked suspiciously like resentment towards someone who'd refused to accept the limitations others had prescribed for her life. The pressure came to a head when Amanda announced that her engagement party would be held at Robert and Nicole's house, the house that had once been Shirley's home, where she'd raised her daughter and built a life that had been dismantled as efficiently as a business liquidation. The invitation felt like a test disguised as a celebration. Could she face her former existence while building her new identity? Could she stand in rooms that held 30 years of memories without being diminished by the woman she used to be? Could she represent herself as someone worthy of respect rather than pity in front of people who remembered her primarily as Robert's discarded wife? "You should be proud, Mom," Amanda said during the phone call announcing the party details. "David's family is very successful, very connected in the community. His father owns 3 car dealerships, and his mother is a partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. They're exactly the kind of people you want to impress if you're serious about building something respectable." The implication was unmistakable. Shirley's modest tutoring business wasn't impressive enough for this elevated social circle. She should attend quietly, blend into the background, avoid embarrassing Amanda with talk of her little hobby that might seem pathetic compared to serious professional achievements. But Shirley had been documenting her students' transformations, and the results spoke louder than social anxiety or family pressure. Diego had made honor roll for the first time in his academic career. Elena had been accepted to her first-choice university with a merit scholarship that would cover most of her tuition. Carlos was now helping other students with the same subjects that had once frustrated him to the point of behavioral problems. Anna's cleaning service had grown from one woman working alone to a team of 4 employees, with a waiting list of clients and plans to expand into commercial contracts that would double their revenue within the year. The 2 women had developed a friendship that transcended their business relationship, each one's success fueling the other's confidence and expanding their shared vision of what was possible when women supported each other's ambitions. Standing in her small apartment, surrounded by evidence of lives she'd helped transform and changes she'd helped create, Shirley made a decision that surprised her with its clarity and certainty. She would attend Amanda's engagement party, but not as the diminished woman who'd left that house 18 months ago in defeat and confusion. She would attend as Shirley Brennan, educational consultant and business owner, a woman who'd discovered that starting over wasn't about going backward to reclaim what had been lost. It was about moving forward to claim what had always been possible, but never been attempted. The woman who'd once crumpled an eviction notice in despair was about to face the ultimate test of her transformation. Chapter 4. Shirley spent her first profitable month's earnings on a professional navy dress that fit her like confidence made visible, and had her hair styled at an actual salon rather than the discount chain she'd been using since the divorce. When she looked in the full-length mirror at the department store, she saw not the invisible woman she'd become during her marriage's slow decline, but the assured teacher she'd once been, evolved now into someone stronger, tempered by struggle into something more durable than her younger self had ever been. The night before Amanda's engagement party, Betty helped her prepare responses to the questions she knew were coming, the subtle interrogations disguised as polite conversation that would determine whether she'd be treated as a success story or a cautionary tale. "When they ask what you're doing now," Betty coached, sitting across from Shirley at the kitchen table that had become command headquarters for her new life, "you tell them you're an educational consultant running a successful tutoring practice. When they ask about your business, you share those student success stories like they're the accomplishments they actually are." "What if they're right, though?" Shirley asked, the old doubt creeping in like cold air through window cracks. "What if I really am just playing pretend, and everyone can see it except me?" Betty reached across the table and took Shirley's hands in her own weathered grip, her nurse's touch still carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades distinguishing between real symptoms and imagined ones. "Honey, you've helped more children discover their potential in 3 months than some teachers help in 3 years. You've built something meaningful from absolutely nothing while people told you it was impossible. That's not pretending. That's what heroes do when they finally stop listening to other people's limitations and start trusting their own capabilities." The house looked exactly the same, but felt like visiting a museum dedicated to someone else's achievements. Shirley stood on the front steps she'd painted 3 summers ago, looking at the garden she'd planted with her own hands, approaching the door she'd walked through thousands of times as Robert's wife and Amanda's mother, roles that had once defined her completely, but now felt like costumes she'd worn in a play that had closed after a long and ultimately unsatisfying run. Nicole answered the door wearing the kind of effortless elegance that unlimited discretionary income made possible. Designer casual wear that probably cost more than Shirley's monthly rent. Perfectly highlighted hair that showed no gray roots. Manicured nails that had never scrubbed toilets or packed school lunches or balanced checkbooks with calculator precision. "Shirley!" Nicole's voice carried the bright, artificial warmth of someone determined to prove she could afford to be gracious to the woman she'd replaced. "You look different. Come in. Come in. Robert's in the kitchen organizing the catering staff." The house smelled like expensive flowers and professional cooking, the kind of entertaining that happened when money was no object and image mattered more than intimacy. Shirley recognized some of the guests, former neighbors who'd shared barbecues and block parties, old friends who'd been part of couples' dinner, parties and holiday celebrations, people who'd been fixtures in her life when she'd lived within these walls, but who now nodded politely as if she were a distant acquaintance whose name they couldn't quite remember. Robert appeared with a crystal tumbler in his hand, his face wearing that familiar expression of mild annoyance that had become his default response to her presence during the final years of their marriage. He looked older, she noticed with surprise, not just in years, but in the way that happened to people who'd gotten what they thought they wanted, only to discover it wasn't quite what they'd imagined. "Shirley, you made it." His tone suggested this was somehow unexpected, as if her attendance at her own daughter's engagement celebration required special effort or unusual commitment. "Of course I made it. Amanda's my daughter, too." "Yes. Well?" He glanced around the room with the territorial pride of someone showing off a successful acquisition. Nicole put together something really lovely, very tasteful, very appropriate for David's family. The implication was subtle, but unmistakable, unlike anything Shirley might have organized during her tenure as the family's social coordinator. She'd planned every gathering, every dinner party, every celebration during their 32-year marriage, had developed a reputation among their friends for creating warm, welcoming events where people felt genuinely cared for, rather than merely impressed. Amanda appeared with her fiancé David, a pleasant-looking young man whose soft hands and expensive clothes suggested he'd never worried about money or questioned his place in the world. She kissed Shirley's cheek with the dutiful affection of someone checking off a social obligation, rather than greeting someone she genuinely wanted to see. "Mom, I want you to meet David's parents. This is my mother, Shirley." David's father, James, had the confidence that came from being the most successful person in most rooms, his handshake firm and assessing in the way of men accustomed to measuring others' worth through professional achievements and financial indicators. His wife, Patricia, smiled with the polished perfection of someone who'd never wondered how to stretch $20 until payday or calculated whether she could afford both groceries and gasoline in the same week. "Lovely to meet you," Patricia said, her voice carrying the kind of carefully modulated warmth that suggested extensive practice at managing social situations. "Amanda's told us so much about your situation. It must be quite an adjustment starting over at your stage of life." The phrase, "your situation," hung in the air like a diagnosis, transforming Shirley's circumstances into a medical condition that required sympathy rather than respect. She was being categorized as someone to be pitied, managed, or politely ignored, the divorced older woman who needed careful handling to avoid social awkwardness. "Actually, I'm doing quite well," Shirley replied, her teacher's voice steady and clear, carrying the authority she'd once used to command attention in faculty meetings. "I've started my own educational consulting business, and it's been remarkably rewarding." James perked up with the interest of someone always alert to networking opportunities, his businessman's instincts recognizing potential value even in unexpected packages. "Oh, what kind of consulting do you do?" Before Shirley could respond, Carol Lewis materialized at her elbow with the precise timing of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this conversational opening. She looked prosperous and satisfied, wearing success like expensive perfume that announced her arrival before she spoke. "Oh, James, Shirley does tutoring for children whose parents can't afford real help. It's very charitable of her, very community-minded." The words were delivered with a patronizing pat on the head, transforming Shirley's business into a hobby, her expertise into pity work, her success into an act of noblesse oblige. The word charitable struck like a physical blow, designed to diminish her achievements by reframing them as altruism rather than professional competence. Carol was telling everyone present that Shirley's work had value only as a generous gesture toward the less fortunate, not as a legitimate business built on genuine expertise. "It's wonderful that she's found something to keep herself busy," Carol continued with practiced sympathy. "At our age, we all need purpose in our lives, don't we? Something to fill the hours and make us feel useful again." The casual dismissal contained layers of condescension. The suggestion that Shirley's work was mere busy work, that women their age needed artificial purposes because their real value had expired, that feeling useful was more important than actually being useful in measurable ways. "Actually," Shirley said, her voice carrying an edge that surprised everyone in the conversation, including herself, "I'm not doing charity work. I'm running a successful business. My students have improved their grades significantly. Several have earned scholarships to universities they never thought they could attend. And I'm expanding to include business consulting services." Carol's eyebrows rose in polite disbelief, her expression suggesting she was witnessing someone's embarrassing delusion rather than a legitimate professional accomplishment. "Business consulting? Shirley, that seems rather ambitious for someone who's never actually run a business before. Don't you think you might be getting a bit carried away?" The conversation around them had begun to quiet, other guests tuning in to what was clearly becoming uncomfortable, the kind of social tension that made people simultaneously want to intervene and escape. Amanda's face flushed with the particular embarrassment of someone watching their family drama unfold in front of people whose opinions mattered to their future. Robert stepped forward with the expression he'd perfected during their marriage, the look of someone preparing to manage an embarrassing situation before it could escalate beyond his control. "Now, Shirley," he said in that familiar, condescending tone she'd learned to hate during their final years together. "Let's not get carried away with ourselves. Teaching a few neighborhood kids isn't really the same thing as running a legitimate business operation." Something inside Shirley didn't just break. It snapped into place, like a bone that had been dislocated for months, finally returning to its proper position. The sound was almost audible, a click of recognition as she realized she would never again accept other people's definitions of her worth or capabilities. "You're absolutely right, Robert. It's not the same as running a traditional business." Her voice remained calm but carried the authority she'd once used to silence unruly classrooms and command respect from colleagues who initially underestimated her abilities. "It's significantly more challenging and infinitely more meaningful." The room had gone completely silent now, even the catering staff pausing in their work as they sensed the shift in atmosphere from polite socializing to something more consequential. When you run an accounting firm, you have clients who come to you because they need services you provide. They pay your rates, follow your procedures, and evaluate you based on your ability to manage their financial records according to established protocols. She paused, letting her words settle while maintaining eye contact with each person who had presumed to judge her work without understanding its complexity. "When I work with struggling students, I have to diagnose why they're struggling, identify their individual learning styles, rebuild their confidence while teaching them skills, and accomplish all of that while charging rates their families can actually afford. I have to be teacher, counselor, academic strategist, and confidence coach, often simultaneously." Patricia looked genuinely interested now, her polished social mask slipping slightly as professional curiosity overtook social positioning. "That does sound quite complex. What kind of results have you achieved?" Diego Santos went from failing 7th grade to making honor roll in 6 weeks. Elena Rodriguez improved her SAT scores enough to earn merit scholarships at 3 state universities. Carlos Mendez went from being labeled disruptive to helping other students with subjects that used to frustrate him to the point of behavioral problems. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder she'd brought specifically for this moment. Not because she'd planned to defend herself, but because she'd learned that success required documentation, evidence that couldn't be dismissed as wishful thinking or generous interpretation. Sarah Kim wrote college application essays that earned her acceptance to Northwestern with partial merit aid. Marcus Williams not only passed the statistics course he was failing, but changed his major to engineering and now tutors other students in advanced mathematics. James leaned forward, his businessman's attention fully engaged now. Those are impressive outcomes. What kind of methodology produces such consistent results? Individual attention, patience, and the willingness to adapt teaching methods to match learning styles instead of forcing students to adapt to inflexible systems. Shirley's confidence was building with each word, fueled by the recognition in James's voice and the growing interest she could see in other faces around the room. "But that's not all," she continued, surprising herself with her boldness. "I've also been working with Ana Morales, a local entrepreneur who's been running a successful cleaning service for 15 years, but wanted to expand and professionalize her operations." "Business consulting?" Patricia asked, her lawyer's mind clearly processing new information. "Marketing strategy development, financial organization, employee management systems, client relationship protocols." Shirley enumerated each service with the precision of someone who'd actually performed these functions rather than merely studied them in textbooks. Anna's business has grown from a one-woman operation to a team of 4, with a waiting list of clients and expansion plans that will double her revenue within 12 months. Carol's face had gone pale, her confident dismissiveness cracking as she realized that her attempt to diminish Shirley had instead provided a platform for her to demonstrate competence that none of them had suspected existed. But before anyone could respond, Amanda stepped forward with an expression of barely controlled fury, her face tight with the kind of anger that came from public humiliation in front of people whose opinions would affect her future happiness. "Mom, can I talk to you privately for a minute?" They walked through the house that had once been Shirley's home, past the living room where she'd helped Amanda with homework, through the hallway lined with family photos that no longer included her, to what had been her home office and was now clearly Nicole's workout room, complete with expensive equipment and mirrors that reflected their confrontation from multiple angles. Amanda closed the door and turned to face her mother with fury that made the air between them crackle with tension. "What are you doing?" Amanda hissed, her voice low but vibrating with rage. "You're embarrassing yourself and you're embarrassing me. These people are important to David's career, crucial to our future, and you're standing out there bragging about tutoring and cleaning ladies like you're running Microsoft or Goldman Sachs." The words hit like carefully aimed arrows, each one targeting Shirley's deepest insecurities about her age, her circumstances, her right to claim professional respect. This was her daughter, the person she'd sacrificed her own career to raise and support, and Amanda was ashamed of her mother's success. "I'm not bragging, honey. I'm simply not apologizing for building something meaningful with my own hands and mind." "Meaningful?" Amanda's voice rose despite her efforts to keep the conversation private. "Mom, you're 59 years old, living in a tiny apartment, making barely enough money to cover basic expenses. This isn't meaningful. It's sad. And standing out there, acting like you're some kind of business mogul just makes it worse." Shirley looked at her daughter and saw Robert's dismissiveness, Carol's condescension, every voice that had ever told her to be smaller, quieter, more grateful for whatever scraps of purpose others were willing to allow her to have. She saw the woman she'd once been, apologetic, accommodating, always ready to minimize her own achievements to make others more comfortable. But she also heard Diego's excitement when he'd finally understood algebra, saw Anna's pride when she'd landed her first major commercial contract, remembered the respect in James's voice when he'd called her results impressive. She heard the voices of parents who trusted her with their children's futures, felt the satisfaction of work that mattered beyond paycheck considerations. "You're right about one thing, Amanda," Shirley said quietly, her voice carrying a calm certainty that seemed to fill the room. "I am 59 years old, and for the first time in decades, I'm proud of who that woman has become." She walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to face her daughter one final time. "I spent 32 years of my life making myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. I'm not going to spend whatever years I have left doing the same thing, not even for you." Amanda stood alone in what had once been her mother's office, her mouth slightly open, as Shirley walked back to the party where her former life was waiting to see what the woman she'd become would do next. Sometimes the people closest to us have the hardest time accepting our growth. Have you experienced this? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. The conversation resumed when Shirley returned, but something fundamental had shifted in the room's energy. She was no longer the pitiable divorced woman seeking acceptance from her former social circle. She was a professional defending her work against uninformed criticism, and several people in the room had begun to recognize the difference. James approached her with genuine interest, his businessman's instincts overriding social awkwardness. "I'd like to hear more about your business consulting work, what you described with the cleaning service expansion. That's exactly the kind of practical expertise small businesses need but rarely can afford from traditional consulting firms." Patricia joined the conversation with questions about Shirley's educational methodology, revealing that her law firm had been struggling to find effective tutoring resources for the children of several partners. "The established centers are expensive, but don't seem to produce the kind of individual attention you're describing," she said. "Would you be willing to evaluate a few students who've been having difficulties?" Word of Shirley's success began to spread through the room as other parents overheard the conversation and began sharing their own frustrations with traditional educational support systems. By the time the evening ended, she had business cards from 4 families interested in tutoring services and 2 small business owners curious about her consulting approach. But as she prepared to leave the house that had once been her home, Shirley realized that the most important victory wasn't the potential new clients or the grudging respect she'd earned from people who'd initially dismissed her. It was the knowledge that she'd finally stopped accepting other people's limitations as her own reality. She had become someone worth defending, and she'd done the defending herself. Chapter 5. The phone call that threatened to destroy everything Shirley had built came at 6:30 on a Monday morning, jolting her awake from the kind of deep sleep that comes only when you've finally found work that matters enough to exhaust you in the best possible way. Amanda's voice was tight with controlled anger, the kind that meant she'd been rehearsing this conversation since she'd opened her eyes, probably lying in bed, constructing arguments designed to penetrate her mother's newfound confidence and drag her back to manageable reality. "Mom, I need you to know that David's mother called me last night. She's concerned about your instability and thinks it might affect our wedding planning process. Apparently, your performance at the engagement party raised some serious red flags about our family dynamics." Shirley sat up in bed, her heart pounding with the familiar rhythm of crisis management, though now she recognized it as the sound of someone else's emergency trying to become her problem. "What kind of red flags exactly?" "She thinks you're having some kind of midlife crisis, some sort of psychological break that's making you act out inappropriately. Standing up and making speeches about your business, contradicting people who were just being polite, turning my engagement party into a platform for your personal issues." The words settled like ice water in Shirley's stomach, each accusation designed to transform her moment of self-advocacy into evidence of mental instability. Her refusal to accept dismissive treatment had been reinterpreted as emotional dysfunction, her pride in her accomplishments reframed as embarrassing behavior that threatened her daughter's future happiness. "Amanda, I was simply responding honestly to questions about what I'm doing with my life. I didn't make any speeches. I defended my work when people tried to diminish it as charity or hobby work. You argued with Carol Lewis in front of everyone. You made Dad look bad by implying his business was easier than tutoring children. You turned what should have been a celebration into a confrontation that made people uncomfortable. Amanda's voice cracked slightly, revealing the genuine distress beneath her anger. Mom, I'm 28 years old. I'm trying to build a life with someone I love, and I need my family to help me do that, not create obstacles that make his family question whether they want to be connected to us. The call ended with Amanda's request that Shirley tone things down for future family events, perhaps by focusing on being supportive rather than drawing attention to herself or her business ventures. The message was clear. Her success was acceptable only if it remained invisible to people whose opinions mattered to Amanda's future. By noon, the sabotage had begun in earnest. 2 of her regular students called to cancel their sessions. Maria Santos apologized profusely, explaining that Diego's father thought it might be better to find a tutor with more traditional credentials and established reputation. Sarah Kim's mother left a voicemail saying they'd decided to try one of the established tutoring centers that offered more comprehensive services and professional oversight. The official letter from the Millbrook Business Licensing Bureau arrived that afternoon, formal and threatening in the way that government correspondence always managed to sound even when addressing minor infractions. Someone had filed a complaint alleging that Shirley was operating an unlicensed tutoring business and potentially violating zoning regulations by conducting commercial activities in a residential building. The letter was dated 3 days after Amanda's engagement party. At the bottom, in smaller print, was the name of the complainant, Carol Lewis. Shirley sat on her apartment steps, the letter crumpled in her fist, tears streaming down her face as the full scope of the attack became clear. The woman who had once been her friend, who had shared coffee dates and shopping trips, who had been a guest at Amanda's childhood birthday parties, had reported her to the authorities for the crime of succeeding, despite everyone's expectations that she would quietly fade into irrelevance. Betty found her there an hour later, recognizing the posture of someone whose world had suddenly become hostile territory. "They want to shut me down," Shirley whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of traffic and her own disbelief. "Carol filed a formal complaint saying I'm running an illegal business. I have to appear before a licensing board next week, and if I can't prove I'm operating legally, they'll fine me and force me to stop everything I've built." "What do you need to prove you're legal?" Betty asked, her practical nursing background immediately focusing on solutions rather than sympathy. "A current teaching license, liability insurance, business registration, zoning compliance documentation." Shirley's voice grew smaller with each requirement, the weight of bureaucratic complexity crushing her newfound confidence. "I've been working on the teaching license renewal, but it takes months to complete. The insurance alone will cost more than I make in 2 months, and I don't understand anything about business registration or zoning laws." The crushing reality of her inexperience felt like drowning in requirements she'd never known existed. Everyone who had dismissed her as unqualified had been right. She was a middle-aged woman playing at business ownership without understanding the rules, and now her ignorance was going to destroy everything she'd worked to create. Anna arrived that evening with a cardboard box full of files and the determined expression of someone who'd fought similar battles and understood that survival required preparation, persistence, and the willingness to learn complex systems designed to discourage people like them from succeeding. "We figure this out," Anna announced with the confidence of someone who'd navigated bureaucracy in a second language while building a business from nothing. "I go through same thing when I start my cleaning service proper. City. They make it hard for people like us, but no impossible if you know how to fight back." They worked through the night, Anna's kitchen table covered with forms, regulations, fee schedules, and the kind of dense legal language designed to intimidate people who didn't have law degrees or business school training. The business registration was straightforward but expensive. Filing fees, publication costs, administrative processing charges that added up to more money than Shirley had in her emergency fund. The insurance was more manageable than she'd feared, affordable if she kept her client numbers below certain thresholds and operated within specific guidelines that her current practice already followed. The zoning issue was complex, but not insurmountable. She could tutor in her home as long as it didn't create traffic problems or noise issues that disturbed neighbors who had legitimate complaints about commercial activity in residential areas. But the teaching license remained the biggest obstacle, requiring documentation she didn't have readily available, continuing education credits that would take weeks to complete, and processing times that stretched far beyond her hearing date. "Maybe I should just accept that this isn't meant to work," Shirley said, as dawn light filtered through Anna's kitchen window, exhaustion making her doubt feel heavier than determination. "Maybe Amanda's right that I'm too old for this, too inexperienced, too late to start over successfully." Anna looked at her with the fierce expression of someone who'd faced similar moments of defeat and chosen to keep fighting despite the odds. "You think I have all proper papers when I start cleaning houses 15 years ago? You think government make it easy for woman with accent and no college degree to run business that competes with established companies?" Anna's voice carried the authority of someone who'd earned her success through battles Shirley was only beginning to understand. She pulled out her phone and showed Shirley a text message that had arrived that morning. "Mrs. Brennan, Diego made honor roll again this semester. His math teacher says he's like a different student, confident and excited about learning. Thank you for giving us our son back. Maria Santos." This woman, she think you too old? She think government papers more important than her son's future? Anna's eyes blazed with righteous anger. You ask her to speak for you at hearing. You ask all parents whose children you help. You show licensing board what real success looks like when it changes people's lives instead of just filling out forms. The idea of calling former clients for support felt presumptuous, like asking for charity rather than acknowledgement of professional competence. But as Shirley looked at Anna's determined face, she realized that building a defense wasn't about proving she was qualified according to bureaucratic standards. It was about demonstrating she was effective according to the standards that actually mattered to the families who trusted her with their children's futures. Over the next 3 days, Shirley made the hardest phone calls of her professional life, explaining the situation to every family she'd worked with and asking if they would be willing to testify about their children's progress and her teaching effectiveness. The responses surprised her with their immediate certainty and protective anger. Maria Santos agreed to attend the hearing with Diego's report cards and academic improvement documentation. Sarah Kim's mother offered to drive home from college with scholarship acceptance letters and essays that had earned merit aid. Marcus Williams' father, a retired military officer with the bearing of someone accustomed to defending people under his command, said he would set those bureaucrats straight about what real teaching looks like when it's done by someone who actually cares about results. But the most difficult call was to Amanda, who needed to hear about the licensing crisis from her mother rather than through community gossip that would make the situation seem worse than it actually was. "Mom, this is exactly what I was worried about," Amanda said, her voice carrying the exhausted frustration of someone whose worst predictions were being confirmed by reality. "You jumped into something you didn't understand, and now you're facing legal trouble that could affect our entire family. What if this gets in the newspapers? What if it affects my job or David's reputation? His family is already concerned about our stability." "I'm not asking you to support me, Amanda. I just wanted you to know what was happening before you heard about it from someone else." There was a long pause, filled with the weight of everything unsaid between them. Years of resentment, competing expectations, love complicated by disappointment on both sides. "Are you going to fight it?" Amanda finally asked. "Yes," Shirley said, surprised by the absolute certainty in her own voice. "I'm going to fight it with everything I have." "Even if you lose everything you've built? Even if the legal fees and fines destroy your finances, even if fighting makes you look stubborn and delusional to everyone who's trying to help you be realistic. Shirley looked around her small apartment, at the evidence of the life she'd created from nothing. The kitchen table that had become a classroom where struggling students discovered their potential. The living room where parents had wept with gratitude as they watched their children's confidence bloom. The bookshelves lined with educational materials she'd collected to serve learners whose needs weren't met by traditional systems. I already lost everything once, Amanda. I'm not going to let it happen again without proving that what I built matters to the people it serves. The night before the hearing, Shirley sat at her transformed kitchen table with a folder full of student progress reports, parent testimonials, and the business documentation she'd completed with Anna's help. She'd done everything possible to prepare, but the outcome was beyond her control now, in the hands of bureaucrats who would judge her work based on paperwork rather than results. Betty knocked on her door with a thermos of coffee and a small wrapped package that carried the weight of ritual and blessing. "This belonged to Harold," Betty said, unwrapping a silver pen engraved with Harold Watkins' 30 years of service. He carried it through every important meeting, every difficult negotiation, every moment when his experience was being questioned by people who knew less but had more authority. He said it reminded him that competence earned through practice matters more than credentials earned through paperwork. Shirley held the pen, feeling its weight and the history it carried. 30 years of a man defending his expertise, proving his value, earning respect through results rather than titles. "Tomorrow, you're not just defending your little tutoring business," Betty said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades fighting for patients who couldn't fight for themselves. "You're defending every woman who's been told she's too old, too inexperienced, too late to matter. You're standing up for everyone who's been dismissed because they don't fit the approved template for success." As Shirley prepared for sleep, she realized that regardless of what happened at the hearing, she had already achieved something important. She had discovered that she was someone worth fighting for, not because others believed in her, but because she had learned to believe in herself. The woman who had once crumpled an eviction notice in despair was about to stand before officials and defend the life she'd built from the ashes of her former existence. Win or lose, she would face them as Shirley Brennan, educator, entrepreneur, and woman who refused to accept other people's limitations as her own reality. Chapter 6. The Millbrook Municipal Building's conference room carried the institutional smell of old coffee and bureaucratic indifference, fluorescent lights humming overhead like mechanical insects. Shirley sat at a scarred wooden table that had probably witnessed thousands of similar hearings, facing 3 city officials whose expressions suggested they'd rather be processing parking violations than adjudicating the professional fate of a woman they'd never met. Carol Lewis occupied the back row with 2 other women from their former social circle, their presence clearly intended to provide moral support for the complaint they'd helped orchestrate. Their satisfied expressions suggested they expected this to be a brief preceding ending with Shirley's public humiliation and the restoration of proper social order. But the other side of the room told a radically different story. Maria Santos sat with Diego, both dressed in their Sunday best, Diego clutching a folder of report cards like evidence in a criminal trial. Sarah Kim had driven 3 hours from college with her mother, bringing academic transcripts and scholarship letters that documented her transformation from struggling student to university success story. Marcus Williams' father wore his military dress uniform, treating this civilian hearing with the gravity of a formal military review, where someone's service record was being questioned by people who'd never faced similar challenges. Ana Morales had closed her cleaning business for the morning and brought 3 of her employees as character witnesses, their presence a testament to the business success that had grown from Shirley's guidance and support. The licensing board chairman, a tired-looking man named Davidson, whose nameplate suggested he'd been managing municipal disputes since before the internet existed, read the complaint aloud in the monotone voice of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. Unlicensed tutoring services, residential zoning violations, operating commercial enterprise without proper insurance or business registration. His words fell like stones into the silence, each accusation carrying the weight of potential fines and forced business closure. "Mrs. Brennan," Davidson continued, peering over reading glasses that had seen better decades, "you're accused of running a commercial tutoring service without meeting municipal requirements. How do you respond to these charges?" Shirley stood slowly, Harold's pen steady in her hand like a talisman, connecting her to 30 years of earned expertise, and looked directly at each board member before speaking. The silence stretched just long enough to establish that she was choosing her words carefully rather than responding defensively. "I respond by acknowledging that the complainant is technically correct about my initial licensing status and completely wrong about everything else that matters in this situation." A murmur ran through the room like electricity. This wasn't the apologetic posturing they'd expected from someone caught operating outside approved parameters. 6 months ago, I was a divorced woman facing eviction, told by everyone including my own family that I was too old to start over, too inexperienced to build anything meaningful, too late to matter to anyone except social service agencies. Her voice carried the steady authority she'd once used to command attention in faculty meetings where her expertise was valued rather than questioned. "Today, I'm here because someone believes that helping struggling students discover their academic potential is somehow wrong if you don't have the right papers from the right offices, stamped by the right bureaucrats." She opened her folder and pulled out Diego's report card progression, the documents arranged with the precision of someone who understood that evidence needed to be presented clearly to people who would judge based on facts rather than feelings. Diego Santos was failing 7th grade when his mother brought him to me. His teachers had labeled him a slow learner with behavioral problems. His parents were considering holding him back a grade, maybe 2, because traditional classroom instruction wasn't reaching him. She held up his progression of report cards like a time-lapse photograph of academic resurrection. "Look at these grades, semester after semester of F's and D's in mathematics and science." She displayed his most recent report card with the reverence of someone presenting sacred text. Honor roll, 3 A's and 2 B's. His mathematics teacher nominated him for the school district's Academic Improvement Award, and he's now helping other students with subjects that once frustrated him to the point of behavioral problems. Davidson leaned forward, studying the documents with the attention of someone recognizing unexpected competence. "That's quite a remarkable transformation. What methodology produced such dramatic improvement?" "Individual attention, diagnostic assessment of learning style, and adaptive teaching methods that matched his kinesthetic processing needs, rather than forcing him to fail in systems designed for visual and auditory learners." Shirley's response carried the precision of someone who understood both the science and art of education. Diego wasn't slow, he was misunderstood. He needed to manipulate objects and move through space while learning abstract concepts. Traditional classroom environments couldn't accommodate his needs, but individualized instruction could. She turned toward Sarah Kim, who stood with the graceful confidence of someone who discovered her own intellectual capabilities. "Sarah, would you please tell the board about your college application experience?" Sarah moved to the front of the room with the poise of someone accustomed to academic achievement, her presence commanding attention despite her youth. "When I started working with Mrs. Brennan 18 months ago, I was a B- student who couldn't write a coherent essay to save my life. I had intelligent ideas but couldn't organize them on paper, couldn't construct arguments that made sense to anyone besides myself." She paused, looking directly at each board member to establish personal connection. "My SAT scores were mediocre. My college prospects were limited to community colleges and lower-tier state schools, and I'd basically accepted that I wasn't smart enough for anything better. "What changed?" asked board member Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman whose genuine curiosity suggested she was evaluating professional competence rather than just procedural compliance. "Mrs. Brennan didn't just teach me writing techniques, she taught me how to think clearly, how to construct logical arguments, how to recognize and trust my own intelligence." Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. "I'm now a freshman at Northwestern University with a partial merit scholarship that covers 60% of my tuition. My high school English teacher uses essays I wrote with Mrs. Brennan's guidance as examples for current students." "And what credentials did Mrs. Brennan present when your family hired her?" Morrison continued, clearly probing for the kind of formal qualifications that bureaucratic systems valued. Sarah looked puzzled by the question, as if credentials were irrelevant to the actual work being performed. Credentials? She presented results. She showed us Diego's improvement. She explained her teaching philosophy in ways that made immediate sense, and she demonstrated techniques that worked with my specific learning challenges. My parents cared about whether she could help me succeed academically, not whether she had the right pieces of paper to satisfy administrative requirements. Colonel Williams stood without being formally recognized, his military bearing commanding respect even in civilian settings. "Permission to address the board, sir?" Davidson nodded, clearly recognizing the authority that came from decades of military service and leadership experience. "Colonel Williams, retired Army Corps of Engineers. My son Marcus was failing introductory statistics at the state university. We hired 3 different tutors through established companies with impressive facilities and certified credentials. Each charged premium rates and provided services that looked professional on paper." His voice carried the measured cadence of someone presenting evidence in a formal investigation. "Marcus continued to fail despite months of expensive tutoring that met every bureaucratic standard for educational services." He gestured toward Shirley with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. "Mrs. Brennan spent 2 hours with my son and identified that he was trying to memorize statistical formulas instead of understanding underlying mathematical principles. She restructured his entire approach to quantitative problem solving, taught him to see patterns instead of memorizing procedures. Now Marcus not only passed statistics with a B+, he changed his major to engineering and now tutors other students in advanced mathematics." Colonel Williams' voice hardened with the authority of someone defending personnel under his command. Mrs. Brennan had 30 years of teaching experience before her divorce temporarily disrupted her career. The suggestion that she's suddenly unqualified to help students because her license lapsed during a difficult personal transition is bureaucratic nonsense that serves no educational purpose and helps no struggling children. Board member Rodriguez, who had been taking detailed notes throughout the testimony, looked up with the expression of someone processing unexpected information. "Mrs. Brennan, the complaint also mentions business licensing and insurance issues that go beyond educational credentials. How do you address those regulatory concerns?" Shirley pulled out the thick folder Anna had helped her prepare, documents organized with the precision of someone who'd learned that success required meeting every requirement thoroughly, rather than hoping good intentions would excuse procedural gaps. "I've spent the past week completing every municipal requirement for home-based educational services, business registration, liability insurance, zoning compliance documentation, tax identification numbers. Everything is filed properly and all fees have been paid in full." She handed complete document sets to each board member. "I didn't initially understand all the regulatory requirements, which was my oversight and responsibility. But when this complaint was filed, I educated myself about every rule and complied with every regulation that applies to my type of educational consulting." Davidson flipped through the paperwork, his eyebrows rising as he discovered the thoroughness of her preparation. "This documentation is remarkably comprehensive. When did you complete all these requirements?" "This week. Because when someone challenges your right to help children succeed academically, you do whatever it takes to continue that work legally and professionally. Morrison leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from skeptical evaluation to something approaching admiration. Mrs. Brennan, I have to ask, why not simply get your teaching license renewed and work within the traditional school system? That would eliminate all these regulatory complications. Shirley looked at the families who had trusted her with their children's academic futures, at Anna, who had traveled from working-class invisibility to entrepreneurial success, at Betty, sitting in the front row with tears of pride in her eyes. Because traditional educational systems failed these children systematically and repeatedly. Diego was labeled learning disabled instead of kinesthetic. Sarah was categorized as average instead of brilliant. Marcus was dismissed as lazy instead of misdirected. They needed someone who could see their individual potential and adapt teaching methods to unlock capabilities that standardized approaches couldn't reach. Her voice grew stronger, carrying the authority of someone who discovered that her expertise had measurable value in the real world. I'm not asking you to lower standards or ignore legitimate regulations. I'm asking you to recognize that professional competence comes from demonstrated results, not just paperwork compliance. These families didn't choose me because I was convenient or inexpensive. They chose me because I could help their children succeed when expensive, credentialed alternatives had failed them completely. The room fell silent except for papers rustling as board members reviewed her documentation and considered the testimony they'd heard. I move to dismiss the complaint, Morrison said suddenly, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd heard enough evidence to reach a clear conclusion. Mrs. Brennan has demonstrated full compliance with all municipal requirements and provided compelling evidence of exceptional professional competence. Seconded, Rodriguez added without hesitation. Davidson looked toward the back of the room where Carol Lewis sat with her mouth slightly open, clearly unprepared for this outcome after orchestrating what she'd expected to be a simple, bureaucratic execution. The complaint is dismissed, he announced with finality. Mrs. Brennan, your business license is approved with our congratulations. Good luck with your educational consulting practice. As the room erupted in applause from her supporters, Shirley felt something profound settle into place inside her chest. Not just relief from immediate crisis, but recognition of her own transformation. She was no longer the invisible woman who had crumpled an eviction notice in despair 18 months ago. She had become Shirley Brennan, educator and entrepreneur, a woman who had built something meaningful from nothing and successfully defended it against people who couldn't see past their own limitations to recognize genuine competence. But the most important victory wasn't the dismissed complaint or the approved business license. It was the knowledge that she had finally stopped accepting other people's definitions of her worth and capabilities. 2 years later, Shirley stood in the conference room of the Millbrook Community Center, looking out at an audience of 43 women ranging in age from 35 to 74. The monthly meeting of Second Act Success, the support group she'd founded for women starting over after major life changes, had grown far beyond anything she'd imagined, possible when she'd first placed that simple advertisement in the community center newsletter. Brennan Educational Solutions now occupied a suite of offices in the downtown business district, employing 6 part-time tutors and serving over 80 students each semester. Ana Morales had become her full business partner, their combined company offering both educational consulting and business development services to individuals and families throughout the region. Amanda's relationship with her mother had required months of careful rebuilding, colored by years of unspoken resentments and competing expectations that needed to be addressed honestly rather than politely ignored. The engagement to David had ended amicably when Amanda realized she'd been trying to build a life designed to please everyone except herself. I spent so much energy being embarrassed by your transformation. Amanda had said during their long overdue honest conversation 6 months after the licensing hearing, that I forgot to notice how much courage it required. I was so afraid of what people would think about our family that I couldn't see how much happier and more authentic you'd become. Their relationship was still evolving, built now on mutual respect rather than obligation. Amanda had even referred several of her colleagues' children to her mother's tutoring services, publicly acknowledging Shirley's expertise in ways that meant more than any formal apology. Robert's story had taken a predictably different trajectory. The accounting firm he'd built during their marriage had struggled after the divorce, as longtime clients began to realize that Shirley's behind-the-scenes organization and relationship management had been crucial to the business's success. His marriage to Nicole lasted 14 months before ending in mutual recognition that they'd shared little beyond physical attraction and social convenience. But Shirley found that she felt no satisfaction in his professional struggles. The angry, resentful woman who had once dreamed of vindication had been replaced by someone who understood that other people's failures didn't validate her success. She had built something meaningful through her own efforts, and that achievement existed independently of anyone else's approval or disappointment. Carol Lewis had never apologized for filing the complaint, but she had quietly begun referring families to Shirley's services when their children needed academic support that traditional systems couldn't provide. Their friendship would never be rebuilt, but a grudging professional respect had replaced the bitter antagonism. Standing before the Second Act Success Group, Shirley looked at faces that reflected her own journey. Women who had been told they were too old, too inexperienced, too set in their ways to start over successfully. "Success at our age," she told them, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived the principles she was teaching, "isn't about proving wrong the people who doubted your capabilities. It's about proving right the voice inside you that whispered you were capable of more than the roles others had assigned to you." She thought about Betty Watkins, who had been the first person to see her potential and the last to doubt her ultimate success. Betty was in the audience tonight, beaming with the pride of someone who had backed the right investment from the very beginning. "When I was facing eviction with $37 in my bank account, I thought my productive life was essentially over. I believed 59 was too old to matter to anyone. Too late to build anything meaningful, too set in limitations to discover new possibilities." Shirley paused, remembering the woman she'd been and feeling genuine gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. "I was wrong about almost everything except one crucial thing. I was capable of far more than I'd been allowed to become during 32 years of making other people's needs my priority," she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction, earned through experience rather than theory. The hardest part of transformation wasn't learning new skills, or navigating bureaucratic challenges, or even facing financial uncertainty. It was learning to trust my own judgment over other people's limitations for my life. It was accepting that my experience had genuine value, my intelligence was real and measurable, and my dreams were worth pursuing regardless of what anyone else thought about their practicality. Anna stood from her seat in the front row, her success story intertwined with Shirley's in ways that demonstrated how women supporting women could create exponential, rather than merely additive results. "Shirley, help me see that language barrier is not intelligence barrier," Anna said, her English now confident and precise, carrying the authority of someone who'd built something substantial. She helped me understand that being immigrant woman no mean I cannot be successful businesswoman with employees and expansion plans. Now I employ 12 people. My daughters study business administration at State University because she see what possible when women refuse to accept other people's limitations as their own reality. The applause was warm and sustained, but Shirley knew it wasn't really for her individual achievement. It was for the possibility she represented. The proof that reinvention was available at any age, that support could be found in unexpected places, that success could be defined by impact rather than just income or social approval. What dreams have you deferred because someone told you it was too late? Your second act might be your greatest act. Share your story in the comments below. This community believes in the power of starting over. As the meeting ended and women clustered in small groups sharing contact information and offering mutual support, Shirley felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered beyond personal advancement. She wasn't just running a successful business, she was part of a movement of women who refused to accept invisibility as the inevitable consequence of aging in a youth-obsessed culture. Her phone buzzed with a text from Diego, now a high school junior enrolled in advanced placement mathematics and science courses, planning to study engineering at the State University, where Marcus Williams had become a peer tutor. Mrs. B got accepted to the summer engineering program at State University with a partial scholarship. Thank you for teaching me that being different isn't being deficient and that struggling doesn't mean failing. You didn't just change my grades. You changed my life and my family's future. Similar messages filled her phone regularly, updates from former students who had achieved academic success they'd once thought impossible, notes from women in her support group who had launched businesses or returned to school or finally pursued dreams they'd deferred for decades while serving other people's priorities. Walking home through downtown streets she now knew as a business owner rather than just a resident, Shirley reflected on the completeness of her transformation. The woman who had once felt invisible now had a reputation, a community, and a legacy that would continue growing long after she was gone. She paused outside the building that housed Brennan Educational Solutions, looking at the professional sign Anna had insisted they install, empowering learners of all ages to discover and develop their full potential. The small apartment she'd once seen as evidence of her failure now felt like home, not because it was luxurious, but because it was authentically chosen. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelves, every photograph on the walls reflected her genuine preferences rather than someone else's expectations or requirements. As she settled into her evening routine, Shirley thought about the eviction notice that had changed everything. It still sat in a frame on her desk, not as a reminder of her lowest moment, but as evidence of how much transformative power could be hidden in what felt like endings. She had learned that starting over at 59 wasn't about becoming someone entirely new. It was about finally becoming who she'd always been underneath all the roles and limitations others had imposed on her authentic self. The woman who had once accepted other people's definitions of her worth had become someone who helped others expand their own definitions of what was possible. If Shirley's story resonates with you, please like this video and subscribe to Weathered Rose Stories for more tales of courage, resilience, and second chances. Remember, it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. Your best chapter might be the one you haven't written yet.